Okay, now they can probably hear us. Stupid settings.
Was there an update again that screwed them up?
I am not sure.
Yeah,
There
they can
we
hear
are.
us now.
Okay, so
Okay, so I'll
there's
just
a
do a couple
hundred.
second pause and redo an intro, or
Yeah, there's just 100 different settings in this thing. I don't know how that one got changed. Okay. Yeah, let's take it away.
okay. Welcome everyone to the second special episode on the 30th anniversary of NitrOS9. Today we have Boisy Pitre, who basically spearheaded that entire second decade almost all by himself. He took it over, as we mentioned on the first episode, from Alan DeCock, myself, Bill Nobel, and Wes Scale, as it became open source. And Boise did a whole ton of side projects we're going to get into as well that became directly involved with it as well. And then he eventually passed it on, which will be our third part episode when we get into it being a very open source project with a lot of contributors from all over the world. But welcome, Boise, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Curtis. It's good to be here with you.
So I guess just to kind of segue from where we left off with our last interview, part one with Bill, myself, and Alan. Unfortunately, Wes was not able to make it. He was the guy actually behind the whole commercial side of it, and put the ads of rainbow, etc. But by that time of 2002, 2001, I think all of us had gotten kind of burned out for doing it for 10 years straight. I mean, Bill and I were developing it at work and at home, so we were working on it literally 16 hours a day in some cases. So. You approached, I think, Alan and myself both. I think Bill had already kind of retired or semi-retired at that point.
Yeah, I was pretty much out of it by then.
Yeah. And I think Alan had mentioned that he kind of helped you with some of the disassemblies and stuff. And I think, kind of getting things started. And I sent the last updated code because I was working on GraphTrib and Wind and a few other things. So I think I sent you those early 2002. So I guess the first question is, what prompted you to want to take it over, especially as a solo project, basically at that point? That's a lot of work. And, the three of us were burnt out already.
Well, you have to put into context the fact that at the time I had, in 2002, I had left Microware in 2000. Having worked for them for 8 years and seeing how OS9 68K was built from source code and how all the tools worked, I wanted to duplicate that process, that software development process for OS9 for the CoCo. And in order to do that, you needed to build the operating system from source. So if you recall, there was the NitrOS. If you look at the pantheon of products back then, there was NitrOS9, which is what you and Curtis and Alan and Bill had worked on. There was the stock OS9 level 1 and OS9 level 2, which people had from Tandy. There was the level 2 upgrade that was semi-released at that point, still somewhat incognito. And there was Alan DeCock had he sold something called Tune-Up, which was a set of patches to OS9 level 2 to make it go faster.
Yeah, that was a 6809. It was basically from notes that Bill, me, and Alan did. He just kind of amalgamated them together. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think he made interrupt handling faster. It just took a fast path in the kernel for
there's some graphics patches and stuff too. I should mention the version 3 level 2 upgrade you were referring to. That was Kevin Darling and a whole bunch of other people, just in case.
Yes, right. So there were disparate groups working on different parts of what was OS9. And on top of that, you could go on FTP sites and you could patch CC3 disk to fix the blob, or patch this module to do that. And there was this dir command that did something that the original dir command in the standard distribution didn't. And there were all these other commands that built upon the command set for OS9. So the beauty and the curse of OS9 has always been that, given its modularity and its ability to be extended easily, you could come up with all sorts of variations. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to see everything under one uniform source base so that we could build, at first, the CoCo 3 version of OS9 level 2 from source into a disk image that could be booted on a real machine or put on a 5 1/4 floppy at that time. So that was my goal with the project. So, and my memory is unclear on this. You kind of hinted around this. I believe I reached out to you you gave me some source, I think, some source code for some modules.
Yeah.
But things like the kernel, IOMan, file managers, I don't think those were in source form. If they were, there were different areas that you could get them in different forms in source. Certainly, the commands weren't all in source form.
Yeah, the basic core operating system we pretty well had to have done because we
Right.
that's what NitrOS9 was built on. But you're right, like the commands directory, there was very little. Maybe
Right.
base 9 was very roughly disassembled.
Oh
So I could do
yeah,
a couple
it
patches.
was roughly disassembled, and not only did it have to be disassembled, it could be disassembled and not commented, but the whole idea was I wanted to comment, to the best of my knowledge, all of the different modules and how they work, so that there could be improvements and iterations of improvement on the operating system. The descriptors weren't disassembled.
Yep.
A lot of drivers weren't disassembled. So the work that I started in 2002 and that Alan DeCock helped me on was disassembling every single module in the operating system, and then B, over time, commenting those modules as I understood them, or bringing in people who understood the particular modules and commented them. So that in itself was a huge amount of work and took years to really perfect.
Actually, before you go on, I do want to ask one question. Mm-hmm. You worked at Microware, and for people that aren't aware of it, I mean, obviously Microware made OS9 level 2 and level 1, right, which NitrOS9 was based on, but we had to disassemble and kind of do it ourselves, and then you had to continue that work. What had happened to the original Microware source code for that? Was it still around it, or was any of it still around at that point?
I had, back in '95, I think I had ran into, there was a move going on at Microware, and there was a cube that had a bunch of old equipment, old CoCos. In fact, that's where I had found that note about the 256 color mode that Mark Siegel had written, I think, that specification on that Tandy Radio Shack page that Alan Huffman later released. Anyway, discovered a lot of that stuff that was being moved. In that was a gimmick system that had, I don't know if it was a 5 meg hard drive or something to that effect, with the source code of OS9 6809 on it. It had an 8-inch floppy disk, and it would have taken me gobs of time and a bunch of floppy disks to try to extract the code. I never got to really do anything with it, and then later I found out that machine was taken out and used for target practice by one of the gun enthusiasts at work. So that source code is gone.
Darn.
The name of that machine, by the way, was Sybil, SYBIL, as I recall. So yeah, the source code did exist, but it wasn't preserved. So I didn't start from that because although I wasn't working for Microware in 2002, I tried my best to not pollute myself by using the source code. I really wanted to go with a full straight-on disassembly, even though technically I would have been violating copyright, I guess. Microware really didn't care at that point.
As said we.
Same
with us. Yeah.
Right. So anyway, I didn't start with although I understood some of the aspects of the operating system, having worked on the 68K, that knowledge kind of transferred.
Yeah, some of the base core concepts between the two versions were the same.
Structures, the structures of device descriptors and device static.
How IOMan relates to SDF and RBF.
Exactly. That was a lot of that was definitely very, very close. So anyway, so getting back to what I was saying, the disassembly and the commenting was one part. Then the second part that had to be done in tandem with that was you had to rebuild or reassemble the disassembled code. So I started the old Motorola 6809 assembler written in C, and I compiled it to run on Linux to use it to assemble the modules that I was disassembling back into binary format. And that's how I validated that my disassembly worked. Because when you disassemble code, you might have code intermingled with
data tables and misinterpret some of these opcodes.
Correct. So you've got to go in there and you've got to play around and figure out, looking at dumps and figure, okay, this opcode, this is an opcode, this is data. So it took a lot of time to do that for each file where you had that kind of disparity. So I took I developed the assembler. I didn't write it from scratch. I took it from Motorola, and I renamed it to, at least the implementation I was doing, to MAMU, MAMOU, which was used for a long time in the project. So I validated that the binary that I would assemble would match the already existing binary that I disassembled to make the source code. When those matched, I knew that the assembler was working for that module.
Yeah.
Move on to the next, move on to the next, move on to the next. So in addition to that tool, then, okay, we have all the modules assembled at some point. How do we build a directory structure that can be read by RBF? Well, that brought in the OS9 and DECB and those command line utilities that would create disk images that would mark the tool shed, right, which became tool shed. And my goal was to do this as quickly as possible for development. I wanted to use cross-hosted tools. I was not interested in building the operating system from OS9 itself, especially on a CoCo. So I chose Linux at the time as my development environment. And actually later in 2002, I moved over to the Mac, and then I used that as my development environment.
Which is Unix, which is similar to...
Which is Unix, right, which was BSD Unix. And so all of the tools for disassembling, or actually assembling, excuse me, and building the disk images were in Linux and BSD Unix.
Okay. So I got a couple questions based on that. So the first one is, you mentioned that you used the Motorola cross assembler as your basis for Mamu. What is the name Mamu? Where does that come from? What does it mean? Or is it just something
Mamu
just made up?
Mamu is the name of a town here in South Louisiana that I was actually born in.
Okay.
It's a small little community. I had to name it something, so I thought, well, you know, what's an easy two-syllable,
It's not a hotbed for
five-letter
OS9
word?
developers, though. It's just nostalgia.
No, not at all. It was just something. I mean, you could have easily think of any small town nearby you that was, you know, would have been kind of suited to. It was just a name. So anyway.
Okay, that's cool.
That. Okay.
So, like Toolshed obviously would have been developed for creating disk images. So the one question I have, we had a few decent emulators like Jeff Avasur's CoCo3 emulator, et cetera, which was a commercial product initially that was starting to use disk images and stuff. How much of the development for testing and stuff were you doing on emulators at that point versus doing it on real hardware?
None. I was doing it all on real hardware. The emulator at the time, I think, was Vavasur's was the one that was really popular. I think it ran on DOS. Yeah. And I didn't use DOS, so I used a real CoCo. Yeah.
Used a real operating system.
I used a real CoCo, and I used a Linux. In fact, I had a 5 1/4 inch floppy on that Linux box that I would use to actually a tool shell would create the disk image, and then I used I think it was FDU tool or some set of utilities under Linux to write the physical floppy so that I could bring it into the CoCo and boot it up. Yeah.
Okay. Now, where does DriveWire fit into that? Because that's when you started getting into not having to have physical drives, et cetera. You could have a PC host type of thing. Was that earlier on in this project, or was that a bit later on, do you think?
No, it was actually early on. In fact, I have the Mercurial was the repository that we had used. I think we actually started with CVS first. And then
you were CVS first when DriveWire first came out. Yeah.
Right. So I've got all of the commit history going all the way back to 2002. I'm looking here. I spotted it early. Let me see if I can find it. The first mention I have of DriveWire in the commits was in 2003, February.
Oh, so that's really early on in the project then. So
yeah.
Now, is that because you were getting sick of having to deal with real floppies all the time? Was that the inspiration for that, or what was the inspiration for you starting DriveWire? That was a question from Brian Weasler.
Yeah,
actually.
it was to accelerate. It was to accelerate the ability to test these images that I was building, because it was kind of a pain to write to a floppy, wait for it,
move it over to the other machine,
and then move it over, and then
right. So obviously developing DriveWire and using a serial cable directly connected from the host machine that was doing the assembling and building of the disk images, and then of course writing the C-based DriveWire server, which again used, I think, curses. Was very much a primitive graphical, text-based graphical user interface. That was all with the intent of speeding up development. Incidentally, that March, I started a project in Boston and was traveling there a lot. And DriveWire became even more important because I was able to take my MacBook or my Power Mac at the time to Boston. Didn't have to tout a floppy in a suitcase, which would have been misaligned and obliterated by the airlines, right? And so that was the motivation for furthering the development of DriveWire so that I could use it while I was away from my main system. And I did bring a CoCo in my luggage. I remember that. So I had the CoCo with the DriveWire cable running the DriveWire server on the the PowerBook, excuse me, and doing the development. So yeah, that's what kind of facilitated and jump-started all that.
Oh, that's cool. So you actually did quite a bit of the development on the road when you were busy with work then.
Absolutely, yeah. After work, I would go to where I was staying at in the cottage and just work on DriveWire, yeah. And the disassembly, the continued work, because this disassembly and commenting didn't happen in the span of a few months. This literally took, a number of years to perfect.
Well, literally, it's also still going on. I mean, Bill and I, like on some of the commercial games and third-party apps and stuff, like those were disassembled enough to assemble, but some of the tables are still wrong and not commented, of course, because they're huge projects. I mean, Rogue's like 48K code. So it's still ongoing. Thanks for starting all that, because that saved us a heck of a lot of time.
Well, and you'll notice that what I did whenever I just didn't have the disassembly, I would literally just do a hex dump.
Yeah, FCPs.
I think it did FCBs. Yeah, it was it was just enough to get something.
So you could build it as part of your disk.
To build it, right. Yeah. And the other thing I might add is that during that 2002 period, I established the directory structure and used the makefile structure. I designed all that. And again, that was inspired by microware. Yeah, that was inspired by microware and the way we did building of the operating system. Then to type one make command and spin off all of the work that would result in the disk images being built.
So you mentioned like in the 1995 that you'd seen some of the 609 code, but it was all on 8-inch discs on the Skimmix machine. How did they build it on there? Was it similar as well, or was it totally different back then?
They built it on the actual Gimmicks machine. So they were building the 6809 version of OS9 on a 6809 machine. Now, I think later they did that on a 68K machine, but I didn't see that. I was, as my recollection was, that later on in the 6809's life cycle, or the OS9 6809 life cycle, they did do cross-hosted development on a 68K machine. If you recall, RMA and RLink, those tools that were in the OS9 development system, were all written in C. That was a reason for that, so that they would be able to compile that on a 68K based OS9 system to do cross-hosted development for 6809.
Okay, cool. And then at some point, and you'll have to kind of guide me on the timelines here, you decided to actually backport it to level 1. You decided to backport to the 6809. You even did Dragon ports, etc., because the Dragon, of course, had its own version of OS9 they were selling in the UK. What rough order did those happen? Do you remember? Or was that all a simultaneous thing? Or?
CoCo 3 was first, and then CoCo 1 and 2 came shortly thereafter, then the Dragon. And of course, the big difference between the level 2 and level 1 ports were the kern, which I renamed from OS9 to KRN. We can talk about the reasons behind all that renaming, which caused some consternation among people, I think, a little bit, especially adding the dashes in front of the options for commands and things like that. But anyway, those obviously, whenever you've done a disassembly of all of the modules for level 2, a lot of that was level 1 code that was microware had ported to level 2. So things like SCF and IOMan, they had level 2 pieces. They had pieces of level 2 specific code in them, but if you commented them out, or not commented them out rather, but conditionalized them out, you could build a level 1 port. So that's
basically
what
just the
inspired
MMU
that.
stuff that was really different.
Right. And so my goal was, again, one source base, one source of truth for all of the modules. I didn't want to have a disassembly of the kernel for level 1 and a separate file for level 2. I wanted one kernel file that I could build for level 1 or level 2 for the Dragon, for the CoCo, for whatever other platform might come along. CPU. And that was the other inspiration, which CPU, right? 6309 versus 6809. And my goal was to base it on the way microware structured OS9 for the 68K, because OS9 for the 68K had different board support packs. There might be a board support pack by Motorola that had it for 68040, or JessPack, which was a company that made boards based on the 68K, might have their own board with their own serial driver serial port addressed to this particular address. So these board support packages were basically just remixed combinations of OS9 modules that would be configured for a specific board. Well, it worked the same way in our world, right? We had the CoCo, the Dragon, we had other 6809 computers that
Gimmicks,
we could afford OS9 to. The Gimmicks, right? Exactly. Yeah. So that's why it was organized that way.
Okay. I'll just mention too, Just Back is also the creator of G Windows, which is a GUI operating system that Bill and I actually had running an
Yes.
OS9000 at work at some
That's
point.
right.
So,
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
so was like when you first got the code, was your plan all along to backport it to level 1 and backport it to 609, or did that come later after you started getting further into it? Like, was that your initial goal?
It was, I knew that I wanted to do it, but you got to be able to, if you're going to, they say the way that you eat an elephant is a bite at a time. And this was certainly an elephant-sized project, right?
Yeah.
I knew that
It
was what I
huge.
wanted to do, right? But I was only focused on the initial CoCo 3 port initially. I knew if I could get the CoCo 3 modules disassembled, that OS9 level 1 commensurate modules were simply a subset of the code in level 2. So that made the most sense, right? You start with the level 2 modules, you disassemble those, you get everything working by assembling each one back into its binary form, build a disk image, and then you go back and say, now I'm going to create a port directory for the CoCo 2, and I'll build kern, IOMan, RBF, all that for that level 1 64K map, and that's what I did. So yeah, the thought all along was to do that. It just took a long time to get there.
You kind of divided it into manageable pieces to go forward.
Yeah,
and kind of
exactly.
that you do.
Mhm.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, because you also, I think you worked on the Atari port for the 609 upgrade card too, didn't you?
Yeah, that was 2012. That was much later.
Oh, that was quite a bit later. Okay.
That was for the Liberate 09 board that I designed. And again, that proved out the decisions I had made 10 years earlier on structuring the ports directory structure of NitrOS9 projects so that you could build different ports of OS9 1609 for different systems. It lent itself to that design pretty well when I was able to do the port of OS9 to that platform.
Yeah, because basically you just had to set some labels to certain values, and you want level
just
1.
create a new directory called Liberate 09, copy all the make files over, start changing make files a little bit, and then create the disk images. Yeah, it's pretty easy.
Cool. So the next batch here is going to be a bit on the version 3 upgrade. So obviously, Alan and I sent you a fair bit of code, and Alan helped you directly with some of the code afterwards, and you did a lot of it yourself, especially the commands.
Yeah.
Like Bill and I had received some running parts of the version 3 upgrade even before Brother Jeremy got them as part of the TC9 project from Frank Hogg, because Bruce Eiston forgot that he was running a version 3, and when he created the disks for us, wow, we have this big new windent that's like a K.5 bigger, etc.
Right.
And I was wondering, did you actually get in direct contact with Kevin, and did you actually get any source code from him, or did you have to disassemble like we had tried to do the same thing?
No, I did not, because I wasn't focused on the level 2 version 3 upgrade at the time. My focus was purely as close to the original Tandy distributed OS9 as possible with the NitrOS9 6309 editions. I knew at some point that we would probably want to get the modules for the level 2 upgrade, and incorporate them. But again, I didn't want to take too much work on. I wanted to focus on specific goals. I don't think I ever actually got to take. I think I did actually. Incorporate some of the modules for level 2.
Some of the module renaming you did, definitely did. Yeah.
Yes. I do recall that because I was inspired by the fact that CC3IO, which I think I recall I renamed to VTIO.
Yep.
Yes.
And then you split it like the level 2 upgrade did too,
right.
having
I
sound
used
driver,
subroutine modules for key drive, sound drive, joy drive.
Which I liked, actually.
Yeah, but we ended up going back a little bit. There's reasons behind that, but yeah, correct. So there was some inspiration taken there. It was more from just looking at the module directory structure in level 2 version 3 versus any kind of actual direct source code that it had.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, Bill and I were kind of entertaining the idea because when we got it, we figured out we had it. No, we did not have CC3IO, and that's a critical part. There's some stuff that's done in there that would be calling like CoWin and Grafter, which we did have the upgrade stuff for. We did not have actually a TC9IO, which is a custom thing Bruce had done, and we made a version 2 of that for Frank. But we didn't have any of the extra calls or the extra parameters being set up and called, so it was a little hard to disassemble. But we, after Brother Jeremy got a hold of it and kind of was able to release it, we ran it, and it was so much slower than what we'd accomplished with NitrOS9. It was kind of like, I don't want to go back to this slow. This is hard to go back to.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start
Well, it
trying
was-
to incorporate bits of it now in ease of use and also passing it back to Tormod. So we'll see what we can do here. But
I think now is a good time, but also recall the level 2 version 3 upgrade was not optimized at all for the 6309.
no.
And it was using the 6809, and it was adding functionality,
Mhm.
which was, of course, especially in the graphics department, which naturally would slow it down, right? I mean, it's expected if you're going to do overlapping, resizing windows, you're going to be using more CPU horsepower, taking up more space for code. Now with the 6309 port, and with, I think, things tightened up better in the code, those features could be revisited and probably even be rewritten with the inspiration coming from level 2 version 3, but not any direct specific code translation.
Yeah, there's some
So
bits in there already. Like we added, just before we handed the code to you, actually, we'd added the filled circle, filled ellipse commands because it's nice and easy. And we had these optimized line commands, even on the 609 version of that we have currently is several times faster than the ones the version 3 upgrade.
Right.
So
that could benefit from obviously there's some benefits that could happen now. So
yeah. But the main reason I was asking is I know that the version that Brother Jeremy has, like if you read the little history that Kevin Darling had written up in 1990, I think it was, right when the project got canceled, is that he had made one, what he called super windows, which was non-stop overlapping resizable windows, which he and Kent and a few others really concentrated on for a couple of months in one summer 89, I think it was. And then he decided that was too slow. And also, it didn't really make that much sense when you needed, you don't have much screen real estate on a CoCo high-res graphics screen. So he pulled that back out and went back to the stopping one. And the version we have now actually has, if you look in GraphTrip, a suspend. As soon as you determine you're not the top window, it suspends every process underneath. So it's kind of more like the Mac OS was.
Yeah.
I think it is resizable and you can move them around and stuff. And like the Super Windows one, you even had it so you could pick up a window on one screen and drop it on a different screen. Stuff that we just started seeing recently on modern machines, relatively speaking. So he was definitely thinking ahead of the time. That's why I was hoping maybe you'd gotten some of the source code. I know you got some of the documentation from him that I had not seen before, which has been critical for me figuring out some of the stuff.
You bring up something. Well, I want to bring up a point. When I found that system at Microware that had all the source code for level 1 and level 2, and this is something I'll never forget, but I have no way of reproducing it, but simply from memory. There was a text file in that directory, and at the time Microware wasn't using email; they were using, I think, some form of UUCP for messaging and so forth, or maybe it was a text file that was printed and sent as a letter, and it was from. I want to say it was from Mark Hawkins to Kevin Darling to arrange a meeting for Kevin and someone else to come to Des Moines at Microware to get the source code to OS9 level 2 so that they could start the level 2 upgrade and travel information and things like that. That would have been a great piece of
history,
OS9 archaeology if we could have captured that, but unfortunately that's lost. But
that could have been part of your book with Bill.
Yeah. So that tells you right there that there was definitely collaboration between Microware. Obviously, we know that, but it's just additional confirmation.
Well, also, I mean, just looking at some of the icons and the fonts that Microware created for the version that got released by Tandy, there was like the resizable window little character thing, and like they had some of this planned ahead of time too. So I'm sure it was expected first, and then they just ran out of time for trying to get it out because it was a little late.
No doubt. Level 2 was late because if you remember, it was supposed to come out, I think, in November of '86.
Yeah, because Rogue came out first with level 2. Remember?
Right. Yeah, I remember people were hacking boot disks off that just to get anything running level 2, and then I think the actual level 2 came out February of '87.
February of '87 is when it officially came out. I know that Microware was under the gun to get that out, and I don't think. See, Rogue had VDG int in it, as I recall, right?
Yes, it
did.
No,
that was GraphInt.
No, it was actually had GraphInt.
It had GraphInt. Okay.
Yeah, it was an older version though. Like if you compare graph-driven GraphInt to the released ones, it was previous versions. It wasn't.
It would be interesting to see what the changes or what the delta would be between those two. But WinDent, of course, was multi-view, and that came out.
And that was
that
halfway
was
through '87 or something, I think. Yeah,
right.
80,
that was the rich windowing interface that was obviously beyond GraphInt. So.
Yeah, that's a bit of cool history on the Rogue thing. You had to buy a game to get the earliest version of OS9 level 2 months ahead before they officially came out.
Yeah. Incidentally, that's how I actually discovered OS9, not with Rogue, but with Deskmate 3. Deskmate 3 also ran under OS9.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I learned how to exit from Deskmate 3 and start playing around with OS9. So.
Yeah. Okay, so you didn't get any help from Microware as far as getting source code. I do know you did get a couple of devs files because you sent me the BASIC9 one, which I think was straight from them, or is that just in common with the OSK?
I don't recall. I don't recall where I got that. There were some devs files that were. It probably wasn't from Microware, but it was from someone else that had a port of level. Because remember,
okay.
OS9
Right.
was sold by Microware in not. They wouldn't sell you the kernel source code unless you paid probably gargantuan amounts of money. But you could get different levels of source code from Microware, including source code for device drivers, so that you could, you build your own drivers for your own port if you wanted to create your own boot support package for a board you were working on. And those devs files there wasn't really any kind of proprietary information. Those were pretty widely available. And I think, in fact, if you look at the devs files, there's a lot of 3-letter abbreviations of the authors of those, and you'll see MGH for Mark Hawkins and some of the other luminaries in the Microware world at the time.
Yeah, because that actually is proven invaluable to me because I've actually been working on BASIC9 again recently. In fact, I think I'm doing the first optimizations to the 6.809 version of BASIC9 since it came out, as far as I know.
Very nice. I think that's a worthy goal.
So that was cool. So you got basically you got all the stuff disassembled, got these cross, making tools, but the assembler from Mamu, you got Tool Shed, which I imagine different pieces of that came at different times. Obviously, you were not just concentrating on NitrOS9 because you've got Deck B, for example. So I'm assuming you were trying to get DriveWire and everything else to work with everybody, regardless of the operating system. Did disk extended basic stuff come later, or was that also part of your original plan to do some support for that?
Well, I think it was part of it, as I recall. It was a natural progression because I needed the ability to create a schizo disk. For some reason, I don't remember why. And a schizo disk is part Deck B, part OS9, as you know.
Yeah, actually, EOU.
So it became natural to just say, okay, I need the Deck B. If we have OS9, the OS9 command line tool to create disk images, OS9 format, the analog on the Deck B side would be Deck B disk skinny. And so, I was writing the logic to read and write one file system. It just made sense naturally as I was going with DriveWire, because DriveWire was more than just OS9. DriveWire was CoCo and all of the file systems that were supported. So obviously I needed to support the creation of disk extended color basic file disk images, and that's why that came about as well.
Okay. I see David Ladd has joined us here on the panel too, and of course he's the one who helped me get the schizoid boot disk for you running to boot off the hard drive image. So welcome, David.
Hello, everyone.
So as the project progressed and you were working on these various side projects, and you've mentioned a few dates, like in the middle, like the 2003 this happened, 2006 this happened type thing. At what point did you start? I guess first of all, was it a completely open source project? Did you get a lot of people kind of like jumping in off the start? Like I know Robert Gold did some stuff for you early. And Soren, I guess I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Soren Rogue. Yeah.
Rogue. Okay, because he helped you with the initial docbook documentation, which is another thing I want to talk about as well, because you actually started duplicating the original Tandy Microware manuals. First, you did them in Microsoft Word, and then I think he's the one who ported it to docbook. Is that correct?
That's right. There was the source code disassembly and reassembly. Of course, documentation is a big part of that. We kind of ambled about deciding what to do with documentation. As you mentioned, we started with a Microsoft Word document, but Soren had come up with the idea to use basically a text-based way of creating documentation or sourcing documentation. And then you could take DocBook, which was the format. I don't know if it was similar to Markdown. It kind of had in the same spirit of Markdown, where you write the documentation in text with some type of a markup language to denote things like italicizing, bolding, headings, and so forth. And that went on for a while, and I think we moved back to Word, or we did some swapping around in the end. I'm not exactly sure the order of that, but I don't know what it is now. What is the form of the documentation? Is it
well, for EOU we're using LibreOffice, because I like the DocBook one. Unfortunately, you have to run it through something to actually view it afterwards, and I prefer viewing it live as I'm editing it. Right. And I've had a few other people helping with that. So
Yeah, that was the motivation, I think, to move toward is we wanted to see like live previews, like WYSIWYG. It was kind of frustrating. Working with DocBook was a lot like working with LaTeX, which is the typesetting system that's used for writing academic papers and things like that. So it was kind of the same idea. You compile the documentation and you preview it. So yeah, Soren did that. Robert Galt came on and helped because Robert had pretty deep knowledge about the 6809 and about certain aspects of OS9. Paul Zabalia, I think, came on and did a disassembly of the Sierra Games modules for OS9.
Which have actually had some patches applied by both Robert and Gwilym Major. Or Gwilym.
Yeah. And I haven't heard from Paul in years. I'm not sure where he's at these days, but he helped early on. Alan DeCock, of course, was mentioned as I mentioned, was very helpful. Robert Galt,
Bob DeRise was in there.
Who's
Gene
that?
Haskett. Bob DeRise was in there.
Bob DeVries. He was an Australian OS9 enthusiast.
Yeah, Nick actually just talked to him not too long ago.
He's good. He's still around.
Yeah,
he helped. So we had a lot of people. We had the people that would come in and dabble and help here and there, and as time allowed, which was very welcome because again, many hands make light work, and if we could get more people commenting, which was my big thing. Disassembling wasn't too bad. That was sort of a churn type of thing. It was almost a mechanical Turk type operation. But what really took a lot of time and brain power, I think, was the commenting because you had to read the source code or the disassembly, understand it, and then try to regurgitate your understanding in the form of comments. And that took a lot of time.
And I'll be honest, the source code we passed you on, because like GraphDrive is one example that sticks out of my head, is I'd be trying to figure out something and of course we had no source code, no depths or anything else to really figure out from. And I would take guesses at certain parts and then I'd comment another 500 lines or something like that, figure out, that was wrong. And then I would, on the newly disassembled part, I would put the proper stuff, but I wouldn't take the time always to go back and correct all the mistakes at my previous comments. So I'm sure our comment tree for you is a bit of a mess.
Well, I just assumed that if comments were there, they were, right or wrong, they were there. I didn't focus on that. I was mostly focused on commenting what was uncommented at the time.
Okay.
So if there were any mistakes made, I didn't catch those. But
now with you, I'm trying to correct some of those. Like I find a few blocks and I remember even, the specific time when that, I figured out, that's wrong.
Well, you think about the work that is still being done on this project that started basically 20 years ago, right? At least the disassembly part. That just goes to show you how long it takes to get to perfection.
Yeah. And it's still an ongoing project especially now that we're getting more into third-party assembly. And I've been using Wayne Campbell's DCOM, his Basic 09 disassembly code, which regurgitates Basic 09 code. It's not perfect, but there's a few tricks you can do to get around it. Because there's quite a few of these old Basic 09 programs that I can get the binaries, but the source was never released. And, some things have changed in the operating system. This is actually where I'll pop in with asking about renaming some of the modules. Like the CC3IO split, I understand, because that was based on the version 3, where they wanted to separate these different drivers so that if you had a sound driv, you could have it as a 6-bit DAC, you could have an ORC90, sound speech pack, any other multitude of cards are available. Some of the other ones, and this is one of the consternation you were talking about, this one I had hit myself personally, is that some code or some programs that I only had binaries for were hard coded for like looking for CC3IO to make sure that's the right driver. So this is a window descriptor I'm going to be changing. And of course, all those broke, and I've had to fix a few that we don't have binaries for. So if you want to explain from your side of things as to why you did that.
Well, first of all, I was inspired again by OS968K and how it did things, how it named modules. And the typical way that you would name a module for OS968K, starting with the kernel, was kernel. And on OS9 level 2, and we had OS9 P1 and OS9 P2. So I had actually thought about naming it kernel, KERNEL. Then I thought, well, that's what 6 characters. I can get it down to 3, save 3 bytes. You're always trying to save bytes in 6809. So I decided to use KRN P2. I could have left it OS9. I guess maybe I should have. Okay, you can shoot me for that one. But
no, I wouldn't say shoot you. I mean, in some cases it made some sense. In some cases it did cause me some issues.
Specifically the CC3IO, which I will, as much of a pain as that is, I'm going to justify that this way. Again, remember CC3IO, the name implies CoCo3.
Yeah.
We didn't
Yeah.
want a CC2IO or CC1IO. CCIO already existed actually, but it existed as a subroutine module for level 1, as I recall. It
Yes.
wasn't an actual driver. I think it was part of the. Am I remembering that right?
That
Was there a
CCIO
CCIO?
was like the BDG ent of the original level 1.
Maybe that's what it was.
Yeah, it was kind of a
So
combo.
again, you had the name of the. It was typical to put the name of the
hardware
specific,
like
the chip specific in the name of the driver, but not the name of the machine. So I wanted to have one name for a module, VTIO, Video Terminal IO, that would work on level 1, level 2, whatever.
Dragon,
Now,
CoCo. Yeah.
that would obviously not be the exact same module for level 1 and level 2 for CoCo 2 or CoCo 3, because CoCo 3 had other things that CoCo 2 didn't in terms of hardware. But that was my reasoning for saying, okay, let's take the pain now and rename this module from CC3IO to VTIO. Yeah, some things are going to assume, because you hard code the names of modules and tools and things like that. Well, yeah, that means you have to change them. But, it's one character less, so it's not like you have to bump it out because it's more than a character or one more character than the original name. It's one less. So it was easy to patch. But those types of things is why I did that. Specifically for the drivers, CC3 disk, again, someone at Microware had
because there's a lot of them.
Right. Had the bright idea, let's name this driver after the CoCo. Well, yeah, okay. So what I did is I took Microware's convention where the name of the driver, the first 2 letters of the driver, the name was the file manager, so RB for RBF, and then what is it?
Then the chip, I think you used the chip number like
1773. That's what Microware did for everything, and for SCF and for RBF drivers. So I wanted to mimic that convention because I thought it was a good convention to follow. Remember, we were creating, or I saw us creating a new version of OS9, an open source version of OS9 that would sort of be the next generation, the next thing to supersede all of these different variants and sort of bring them under one source repo to rule them all. So I thought if we're going to make a name change, now's the time to do it. Where I'm trying to do all this. So that was sort of my motivation. And that also extended to the commands, because if you recall in OS9 level 2, all the commands that came with the operating system, whenever you'd use an option like dir, you wouldn't say dir -e.
Yeah, it would just be the letter itself.
Right, just the letter, which you can get some ambiguity between that if you want to use, if you wanted to get a directory of a directory named E versus
an extended directory.
An extended directory, right?
I totally agree with you on that one.
I wanted to close that. I wanted to close the loop on that ambiguity, and so I decided again that I would make all commands use a dash to precede the option. In fact, in the level 2 development system, a lot of those commands that were written in C, like make, and like RMA, they prefaced their options with a dash, because why? They were written in C. Those commands actually ran on the 68K to cross-assemble back to the CoCo or the 6809 platform. So why have some commands in the commands directory that use options and some don't? Let's move to whatever the 68K as an inspiration was doing at the time and do that.
Yeah. No, the dash one I definitely agree with. The only thing is there's a couple of them got a little bit wounded because we allow dashes in file names.
T-mode and X-mode was again. You got to
kind of weigh like what you're trying to do there, right? Yeah. Right. I guess if it had been earlier, I mean, there was a couple times where Kevin and them were also planning on doing some changes similar to what you're saying to make it more standardized. And they would have had the same problem, except it would just have to be earlier in the time frame. So the developers of these software that we only saw binaries of were still around and could have made changes. They've since disappeared, and that's been the issue. But now that we have decompilers for base 9 stuff, I have been going through and fixing them. So it's just a bigger project, like you were mentioning. You have to go through everything to change it all. And I mean, other operating systems have gone through this too, where if you do a core change, which is for the benefit of everyone in the long run, the short run, it's short-term pain for long-term gain, basically.
Right. That's exactly right. You got to just decide when you're going to cut your finger, right?
Yeah.
And I decided that was the time to do it.
No, I agree with that. Like the T mode, D mode is the only thing because there's so many programs that use T mode with the old parameters and stuff there. So that has a lot of changes I have to do.
I will quote Barry Thompson on the October 1986 Princeton Rainbow Fest Roundtable when someone was complaining about the fact that the CoCo 3 keyboard's break key was off by itself, isolated, and the person kept hitting the wrong key. And Barry's response was, "You'll get used to it." Well,
Yep.
that's kind of what my thought was.
It's
We'll all
exactly
get
like the
used to
clear
it with
key
the
because it
change.
moved, and I remember people actually published patches to change the keys, how they registered. So if you had clear with something else, just for that exact reason. But
Talk
then,
about
like you said,
fighting progress, right?
Exactly.
But anyway, that's the nature of software, nature of development.
I'm just going to go through a couple of comments here before we continue on. Exxon Paradise says, and next up, a NitrOS9 build system using Ghidorah, which is your networking system, to farm out individual compiles to a CoCo network. I don't know if you tried that
I'm
yet
sorry,
yourself.
that was a question or someone's doing that?
It's kind of a comment, but just to mention for those who don't know that you actually created the Ghidorah project, which is a kind of a serial networking system for CoCo. Terry Steggy says, Boise, were the devs using the MM1? Now, I can't remember. You were involved with some of the OSK stuff, the MM1 stuff as well.
Yeah, that came later. And no, actually, no, that was before 2000. That was in 1995, 1994, when I was at Microware. Kevin Darling had given me, or granted me use of the source of WinIO was the module.
Yeah,
for
K Windows.
And then and I wanted to use different manufacturers' mice. So I created a user state program that would read the mouse, I think, and shove those coordinates over to the drivers somehow through a data module. I think, yeah, I did some work. It wasn't anything big, just some minor modifications.
Exxon Paris also says the 2-character driver prefix reminds me a bit of how Percom did their device control block names. That is one thing I definitely agree with, because one problem we had, CC3 disk would say the driver for the floppy controller. That could be the standard Tandy one. That could be a patched one for 20 sector per track things. It could be the name of the IRQ driver for the supercontroller 2 by disto is the exact same name. Which I mean made some sense in the fact that if a utility was trying to grab a device descriptor to see does CC3 disk own this particular device, and it wouldn't matter which disk controller you have. But on the other hand, you could accidentally put in the wrong CC3 disk and have your machine completely crash and not have a clue what's going on. Having your method of actually naming it, basically after the name of the chip or whatever that particular driver is for, makes it so much easier for people to build boot files going, okay, I have a 1773 based or 1793 based or a disto based or whatever. You instantly knew which one to put into the boot file. So I think that made a lot more sense.
Yeah,
Yes.
I don't recall what I did for the disto and for the Sardis, how I named those. I don't
They're
remember.
still actually named disto in the current form on SourceForge, but
No, is that the file name or the module name?
the module name.
Okay, so the module, the driver for the disto supercontroller is
It
called
still
disto?
uses most of it uses the RB 1773 or 74. I can't remember the names of
73.
those. Yeah, but the descriptors are named disto wise.
Yeah, but you see the ambiguity might still be there because RB 1773 for the disto, if the file name might have RB 1773 underscore disto SC2 or whatever, but the module name, which is going to reside in it, might still be RB 1773.
Yeah, which is technically correct. They both use 1773. It's just the disto has a 256 byte cache. So
right. Yeah. So either you rename the module to something different, which means you need another descriptor to reference the module, or
that's like 6 of one, half dozen the other. That's either way has benefits and disadvantages.
Right.
Well, it doubles.
You could go down the rabbit hole with it. Yeah. That's right. I mean, already. I mean, just think let's think of the massiveness of the number of descriptors that are created whenever you do a make inside of one of the NitrOS9 ports, right? I mean, it would just multiply even worse. So,
like disk drives itself. I mean, you've got 35 track, 40 track, 80 track, single side, double side, single density, double density.
Every
plus
variation
every controller known to
and
man.
adds.
Yeah, it's and you up to 4 drives at once per system, so it's a lot. Yeah, totally agree with that. So you actually did your testing on real hardware. You weren't using emulators back in the time, and you had basically moved all development off the CoCo, or did you still do some building on there? Like, did you ever want?
No.
And was
No,
that
I
just
didn't
due to
want
the
to.
speed or convenience or both? Or
Yeah, time was valuable. I didn't want to spend my time fighting.
Actually,
building on an old
I'm the
system.
same way now. Most of my development I actually
Yeah,
do
I mean,
on a cross compiler.
yeah,
think about this. Just for comparison, I don't remember the speed on now. It's probably 5 seconds and everything is built, but it would maybe take a minute or two to build an entire level 2 source tree into binary on
Yeah.
a Linux machine back then. On a CoCo, it would have taken
Hours.
hours and hours. There's just no way I'm going to do that.
now this is one where we have a bit of a difference opinion there, but I probably would have been on your side at that time. What has changed now? Like, I'm so used to, like, it's second nature for me to use ASM and RMA, et cetera.
Mhm.
Now that we have emulators that emulate really well, and you can just unlock the CPU, clocking it down to what a real CoCo does. I mean, you can do
Right.
an assembler of an entire boot file in the same amount of time you can do it cross assembly. And I don't even have to exit the CoCo quote unquote environment inside the assembler.
Mhm.
So,
Sure.
I've kind of stuck with the old school thing, and I can still do it on a real CoCo if I want to.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that's quite a bit slower, but you didn't have that opportunity. Like you said, the only real emulator out at the time, I think, would have been Vavasaur's. May might have had some CoCo stuff, but I don't know how robust it would have been back that early. So, I definitely understand why you did it the way you did.
It wasn't just that. I was taking an existing assembler that was written in C, and believe me, writing in C is a lot easier than writing in assembly when you're talking about a complicated piece of software like an assembler. Again, it wasn't to diss the CoCo anyway. It was just a matter of optimization and use of time. To extend the assembler, to write the tools for toolshed, all of that being done in C versus assembly, it was just untenable to do. Now, you're right. You can certainly run an assembler on a CoCo and assemble everything super fast by running it on a modern machine, but you're still limited to the 64K address space limitation of 1609. So you can't go too crazy on sizes of assemblers, or you still have to do things right. If you're going to do a C compiler on a CoCo, you still have to do it where you chain different parts of the C compilation process from one piece to the next, whereas you could do that much more in a monolithic way on a modern system.
I guess in my particular case, and this was kind of a sort of an off joke back in the day, is that if an operating system is not capable of making itself, it's not a real operating system, is kind of how we viewed it, because there was quite a few things that only could be built by a cross compile, especially the earliest machines. And so I mean, I didn't have anything against being able to do it a different way as well, but I do want NitrOS9 to be able, because especially when people are coming into it now and never used OS9 or NitrOS9 before, a lot of them want that full retro feel. So they were only making small little assembly projects because they're just learning OS9 assembly language. They're not making like Rogue or something that would take or a whole boot system like you were talking about. So I do want it to be able, and I did optimize like the ASM assembler to speed it up a little bit, as I mentioned to you before.
That's good work. I don't think that's bad work, Curtis. That's good work.
No,
you understand that you're still
working. I want to try to appeal to both sides of the coin here, because there's people like you that want to work on huge projects, or Bill's working on a game that's a huge project right now that kind of falls into this category as well. And you don't want to have to sit there and wait. Whether you do it through an emulator, whether you do it through cross compile tools, you don't want to wait 3 minutes for a big program, for a single program to be assembled. So you definitely want to use these more modern tools to be able to do it quickly. But if somebody's just trying to learn something, I don't want them to have to go out of the environment, figure out how to run all this DOS, Windows, OS 10, Linux stuff or whatever to be able to cross assemble a quick little hello world program type thing, copy it over to the CoCo image, and then do that. So basically, I'm trying to cover both bases. So.
Well, you're always going to be able to do that. You'll be able to cover 50, 60, 70, 80% of what you can do on a main system, even though it might be slower. But for that 10 or 15% that just you can't do because of the memory limitation, you can't do it. If you're willing to spend the time and want to improve the tools, that's fine. I mean, I'm not going to spend my time using the tools natively. Go right ahead. But it's fine. I mean, it's to each his own, right?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like the discussions you guys have had on your podcast. We've had in our podcast about, what is retro? What is quote unquote true retro? And it's different for everybody. Like some people want full nostalgia. I want to only run the original hardware. I only want to run the original software on that original hardware, and that's it. I don't want to do anything else. And right up to other people who want to, push the hardware to the limit, but using modern tools to create it, so it doesn't take so long. And you can do much faster testing and everything in between. So that's all good.
But even when I worked at Microware, just as an aside, we could build OS9 68K on an OS9 68K machine. We could, but when we needed to get done much faster, we actually had Sun-based workstations on our desks, and we used, again, cross-hosted tools to do that. But we could do it both ways. It was not that we were just stuck on one way.
Yeah, I'd also imagine they wanted to keep the native version going, just so you could do an assemble in the field, like if you were visiting some client and they needed some driver change or something. You don't want to have to log into your Sun system.
Yeah, the versatility. Now OS9 68K, you could do pretty much everything you could on the Sun system and probably just as fast. Again, the CoCo is more limited because of the 64K addressing space, and that's just a fact of the matter. But if you're assembling a small Hello World program, or you're going to link a few modules that aren't that big, a few relocatable macro modules, RMA modules, it can be done. That's fine.
Yeah. And there's no wrong approach. It's whatever you're comfortable with. Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
And that's actually what I like about Mamu and Boise's Mamu and William Assell's LW is there's just changing the def files between going from the cross compiler back to the original ASM.
That's how we're doing our code now, because that's how when we submit to Tormod. And actually, I think he's planning on doing an update based on some of the changes we've been doing the last couple of years. And basically, we try to get it so that it's very minor changes to get it to assemble either way.
Right.
So
I know that with Mamu and with the LW tools, there's things that you can do with those. There's directives you can use that just aren't supported on the local assembler, and that's just
which I avoid myself. Like I don't.
Right,
like
you can if you
yeah.
want to maximize compatibility. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. If you want to chisel the stone.
Yeah.
So getting into coming up towards the third decade, and this is when you kind of got out of it personally, because you've got a lot of other stuff on your plate. You've been, getting degrees, and you, of course, involved with the what's the official name of the OS9 project that you're doing with the guys in Florida? Is it Libra?
Turbo 9. That was very recent, though. I've only been involved with that for a year. Turbo 9, yeah.
But you've also been doing like Ghidorah, like we mentioned earlier, and a bunch of other things. Like you've definitely kept active in the CoCo community. Just that I was going to ask you, actually, when you started kind of passing it up more for the other people to kind of join in as an open source project, were you hitting the same wall that we had hit, where you just kind of get burned out on the whole thing because you've been doing it for 10 years? Or were you just, your interests were just changing?
Some of it is, I mean, obviously, I don't want to work on the same thing for a long time, but I also had largely met the goals that I had originally wanted. And that was, I wanted to build the operating system from source into binary format and in a way that could be distributed via disk image. I'd done it. I mean, I did level 1, level 2.
Yeah.
I'm not just me. There were other people that helped. I don't want to make it sound like it was just me. We did it as a team. I met those goals and I wanted to do something else. So I wasn't interested in so much the graphical aspects of OS9, like multi-view. I remember we did bring G Shell over, right?
Yeah.
Or G Shell was put into the repo, into the NitrOS9 repo. But I wasn't interested in spending time perfecting that. I had put what I had felt I had done was contributed a process, a workflow, and an organization that people could then build on to do other things, to take it to the next level. And I was interested in moving on. So that's how I saw it. Now, I was still at the time working with Mark during those 10 years, and we were doing hardware projects, and I would take some of the source code that I would write, specifically drivers that I wrote, and fold that back into the repo. So I wasn't totally removed from it. I would contribute, but I wasn't at all leading any kind of major effort at that point.
Yeah, one of those projects you'd mentioned when we were going back and forth earlier was the super driver model, where you kind of divided the disk into low level versus high level to actually shrink them down a bit.
Right.
Allow you to have
that was inspired. That was inspired again by Microware's way of doing things.
And actually, that's actually what I use with Glensize IDE.
Yeah. So that was a product that I had. I think I built that in 2003, 2004 for the Super IDE. And then made a low-level module for the TC3 SCSI controller and maybe a couple other things. And then I sold it for a while through Cloud9. And then at some point, the support questions just became too much for me time-wise. And I had to make a decision. Do I want to, take money? And because when you take people's money, they own you for, you owe them the support, right? And it was getting to where the money wasn't meeting the demand for the time that it was taking to support it. So at that point, I'm like, you know what? I enjoyed writing this. I wrote it for myself. Other people benefited from it, and I just open sourced it into the NitrOS9 repo.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we did, because we did the same thing in the same order. We went from the pay model for the first few years of NitrOS9, then we went to kind of a freeware, just because, I mean, everybody had already bought it once and we were doing free upgrades anyway. So, and we wanted to spread it around. We wanted to get people running, a need for a 609 chip was created. We wanted to spread it about. And then eventually we went, give it to you guys to put into open source because, the support thing, I was getting calls at work type of thing.
Same thing with DriveWire. I sold DriveWire and I sold cables and it was fun, but at some point it's like, okay, let's just open source this and make it free for everybody. Glad I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and this is one question I do want to hear what your reaction is going to be. So, given the sheer scope of all the updates, the documentation, cross-platform projects, of which we went through numerous ones, some of the specialized projects that became kind of parts of NitrOS9 weren't specifically created for it, or only for it anyway, like DriveWire, etc. Out of that entire 10-year span, everything you did, what part of the project, if any, specifically, were you the most proud of? And it could be a broad one, like even if it's just like you said, to get it to the point where you could cross-assemble, build it. Like if that's
I mean, that was a big accomplishment right there. Just the fact that whenever I got 2 ports working, that was my best moment, I think. The CoCo 3 and I think the CoCo 1 and 2, which again, they weren't that different. It wasn't a huge leap to get one working from the other. But it validated what I always knew when I started the project, that the best way to create an operating system, especially for multiple platforms, is to have one source of truth for each module, and that's one source file. When I was able to take ioman.asm and make level 1 versions and level 2 versions, or take kern, make level 1, level 2 versions, when I was able to use the toolshed code, the toolshed project, to build those disk images, it was the culmination of months and months and months of hard work that met the vision that I had envisioned for it, and that was a pretty proud moment. And the other one, in all fairness, is DriveWire. I think DriveWire had, especially in that time period, did a lot for bringing people into the color computer hobby and the NitrOS9 hobby, making it easy and inexpensive for them to experiment with NitrOS9. One can argue that it's been surpassed by CoCo SDC and other things, which I granted is the case, but it's still a useful product. And I think that particular product has made a huge impact on the CoCo community that I'm particularly proud of. So I would say it's DriveWire and the NitrOS9 project, and getting it to the point where it was proven to be useful in the form that I had envisioned.
I would totally agree with you on DriveWire. I mean, the fact that the CoCo SDC supports DriveWire built into its ROMs, I think, is testament to that.
And I use it to this day.
and Nick Parentes, that's all he uses. He does. Yeah, that's what he uses for all of his game development is DriveWire.
Yeah. So that's to answer your question. Those are the 2 points.
Okay. And then kind of continuing along this line of kind of a summary thing. Is there anything that you regretted later or wish that you had done differently?
On the project?
Just any of the projects in general, like during that 10-year span.
I wish I would have, like, if we go back to the kern thing, I kind of wish that I would have been a little less aggressive on renaming some of those modules. I don't regret the driver renaming. I do regret that the impact on some of those module names made things like building boot files natively using OS9 Gen a little bit more difficult and cost some people some pain.
It caused quite a bit of pain there, but I actually have workarounds around it, which were better than OS9 Gen.
Yeah, and again, once you get everything disassembled, you can change it and reassemble it and bring it to that new level. But it did cause some consternation and some constipation probably for some people.
Yeah.
So that's what I regret. I regret some of that. Now, what I don't regret is things like the dash option. I know people will argue with me till they're blue in the face that Emo should not have any dashes in front of it. But you know what? We brought it to parity.
The thing is, though,
in a good
Boise,
way.
I have to agree with you on the dash thing because a lot of operating systems use that dash for options.
Yeah.
And it removed the ambiguity that I talked about.
Well, yeah, because we had third-party utilities from like Keith Alphonse and a bunch of others that did use dashed options, even back in the CoCo 3's heyday when it was still being sold actually by Radio Shack. And yet some of the micro ones did not, and it was not consistent, and that's just horrible design.
No.
To have a mixed bag of how everything reacts. The only thing I'm going to try to patch, I think, is that there's a few places where, because we allow dashes and file names, some of the parsing doesn't check to see if the dash is the first character, and it'll kind of like cut off a file name or something if it's in the middle. I've hit a few of those. I've actually fixed one or two of them, but just minor thing. It's just probably something people just didn't think about at the time.
If you go in the repository and look in the commands folder, there is a file called ngu.asm, I believe. That, I think it stood for Next Great Utility. That's an assembly language template for writing a command line utility that handles things like parsing options and command or file names interleave.
Yeah.
Very, 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 very elegantly. Now, you by default, you get it's a little big, in other words, it's not like you're going to get a 24-byte command out of it. You're going to get some level of size that's going to just come in right away because of the fact that it has this functionality.
Full parser.
But I wrote that utility. I wrote that as a
C-start
template to say, exactly, this would be C-start for command. It's like, hey, use this as a way, and it had routines that you could call to parse commands effectively and get back arguments or process arguments and intermingle file names. That kind of stuff. I'll give you another example, something that just popped in my head. How many times have people been bitten in OS9 by fragmented boot files?
Yes.
Do you know how easy, if I could tell you how easy it was to extend the boot module to support fragmented boot files for 6809, it was not that big of a deal. Yeah. Somebody just needed to sit down there, write the code, optimize it a little bit so it would fit within the boot track. And now we have literally, we can go and boot from a fragmented boot file. Things like that, just small stuff that really raises the bar, took a little bit of time and effort, but made things so much easier for people.
Yeah, and I think that's a common goal all three of us here have had throughout the development of NitrOS9, right from the start, trying to make things a bit more consistent, fixing, bugs, etc. And just making things both easy for the programmer and for the user. I mean, EOU is concentrating more on the user, obviously, ease of use. But the first run of NitrOS9 as a commercial product, we were trying to make it better for the developers. We're trying to give them like new APIs or system calls, bug fixes, speeding up things so that things work better, et cetera. And I think that's something you definitely continued. You were trying to make it easier for the developer by having, cross-assembly tools and stuff to speed up the whole development process and being able to do larger projects without a bunch of weird workarounds, try to get it to fit like you were mentioning before too, and also be able to make a boot file easily for different devices just by changing a couple of flags. So that's a common goal. And I guess the last question, so we kind of covered what you're most proud of. We kind of covered what you might have regretted later. The final question along that line of questioning is, are there any particular things that you plan to get to but just never got the chance to? Or did you basically accomplish every goal that you set out to do?
No, I think I did everything I intended. If I would have missed out on something, if there was something I really wanted to get done, I would have gotten done. I think my goal of getting it to a point where I was happy with it and that other people could take it further is exactly what I intended to get done, and that's what I did.
Well, you definitely beat us there because by the time we hit our burnout period, there was a ton of stuff we still wanted to get to, especially in like windowing and stuff that we just never got to. Look, now we're starting to, but
that's another thing I want to add here. I see this as sort of helping everyone else. You guys did a great job to bring NitrOS9 even into existence, right? Taking the 6309, extending NitrOS9 to it. I don't see what I did as, it was important work, but it was a natural progression. Someone had to do it. It could have been me, it could have been you, it could have been anybody. Now with the ease of use project, now it's taking it to the next level. This is just the natural progression of work, and we all, I think, should be proud that we had a part to play in that progression.
I agree. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons when I can't remember who told it, because I hadn't even thought about it, that this was the 30th anniversary of NitrOS9 first being released in 1992. And kind of going through, there's like literally there's 3 decades of very different approaches of what was trying to be accomplished, and with different teams of people too. So that's one of the reasons I want to do a 3-part kind of a history of it, because we don't really have a history of it per se.
Right.
You touched a bit on your book with Bill, but I mean, it wasn't a NitrOS9 book, obviously, so it's not going to go into extreme detail, which is what these interviews are primarily shooting for, and try to get this history down. I mean, I've still been trying to get in a hold of Kevin Darling to see. I would love to get some of the version 3 upgrade people on for interviews, like Bill Dickhouse and
Bill and Mark Griffith.
Bruce Eistead, Kevin Darling. I mean, Ken Myers has passed away, unfortunately, but Ken, at least I got to talk to him a lot of times at the festival. I have a bit of the history from just talking to him over the years, and he's gave me all the G shell source code, which is now part of UU and NitrOS9.
Well, Mark Siegel ought to be able to give some insight on that too. So
I mean, I've seen some of the emails back and forth that Mark and Microware had when they were designing the upgrade, and Mark's actually in the chat, but I think he was earlier.
There you go. Yeah.
Actually, some more comments on there. Exxon Paradise says cross compiling is extremely retro. How many microcomputer ROMs were created on cross compilers? Absolutely true. Because a lot of the earliest machines, the hobbyist machines, only have like 2K, 4K of RAM. So,
sure.
It'd be interesting for people like me, that's Excel Paradise again, to be able to contribute to an improvement pool like a Patreon to encourage more development. Yeah, I wouldn't mind getting paid for it once in a while. Yeah, sure.
Don't we all?
He also says DriveWire is a key tech that for the CoCo that enabled so many other developments. I have to agree with that. I mean, I was kind of out of the picture during that time when DriveWire was actually at its peak, but I knew, like Nick, I was still talking to Nick because I was still running the game's webpage and stuff. And I mean, they were just swearing up and down how great this was, that you could just plug it in. You didn't need to plug in even a cartridge into the cartridge slot. You know, just plug it directly in your PC with a serial cable and away you go type thing. I know a lot of people really love DriveWire, and I've used it a bit. I know Bill uses it regularly, Nick uses it regularly. I don't use it as much just because mainly most of my time my CoCos are in completely separate rooms, and I didn't want to, have cables all over the house. But,
yeah, that's fine.
But I totally understand that, and it I think because the hardware of hard drives and stuff for the CoCo had gotten really hard to get a hold of, and we were using older and older equipment like ID and MFM that you couldn't get anything anymore. It was that stopgap we absolutely needed, or development would have stopped on a whole bunch of projects, DOS, this basic or OS9.
It's interesting because DriveWire is a product that could have existed back in the 80s if we had a fast enough computer on the other end of the serial cable, right? There was nothing. It's like a lot of things today that are built, not necessarily hardware, but software, in that, these things could have existed back in the day. And DriveWire, as I think I had mentioned, maybe not in this interview, but I've mentioned it before, that what inspired me about DriveWire was seeing Chris Decker's, I think it was called HS Link product at the 1994, 1995 Rainbow Fest, where he had a PC running to connect to a CoCo at 38.4 kilobits. You remember that?
I remember hearing about that, but I never actually
I remember seeing it actually, because that was right when he was doing basic boost and run boost too, like basic 9 boost and then the graphics driver boost for 609, his own separate product. And then he also had a high-speed link.
That product, HS Link, I think he was just doing file transfers. He wasn't doing he wasn't doing file
the actual disk interaction
sectors, right? It wasn't actually serving sectors. I got the idea of doing that. I forgot exactly how that came to me, but it's like when I realized that was where you could do OS9, disk basic. It didn't matter what at that point. The PC on the other end was just another drive device. And the beautiful thing about DriveWire was that, again, with a $10 cable and some software and a PC, you could get going. You didn't need to have any kind of moving parts or anything else but just that. So
yeah, it definitely lowered the cost to entry, especially when those older hard drives and floppy drives were getting harder and harder to get and working. Yeah. So yeah, I think DriveWire was a critical tool during the time frame we're talking about here, just in general for the CoCo, not just NitrOS9, but in general for the CoCo, because that was basically what a lot of people, that's all they had access to.
Right.
And it also dropped the barrier of cost.
Well, and the other thing too is DriveWire is out before the CoCo SDC too. Remember, so.
Yep.
Well, it made the development of the NitrOS9 project so much easier. I mean, it was just it was just a game changer and accelerated the development. That was the thing. If it took too much time for me to do something, I would get discouraged pretty quick. I needed things to. That's why I did the cross-hosted development. I needed to feel like I was making progress pretty fast because I wanted to see results as quickly as possible, and that encouraged me. So
yeah. Bill and I in the first days, like when we were doing everything, under a NitrOS9 itself. I mean, our way of getting that same effect that you just talked about was we'd be assembling some big project in one window, but we'd be adding source on the next project because we'd be jumping between modules. So we still had that sense of accomplishment. I'm editing CC3IO, but GraphDrib's assembling over here type thing. So that was our way of doing it.
And there's some satisfaction doing it natively.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I still do it natively, like on a real machine, but it's not as often nowadays.
Yeah, or on smaller projects when it's not.
Curtis, your motto ought to be "Go native."
Go native or go home. Yeah, I mean, you were also talking a bit earlier about the stuff that you could have done back in the day. And I mean, like all the optimizations that we've been doing for like the graphics subsystem and 6809, 639 could have been done back in the day. I mean, the 6309's been out since 1985. 6809's been out since, the CoCo first came out there. So just using different, programming techniques and algorithms, et cetera. And you can see some of the speed ups, like the buffered writes that Alan DeCock put into SCF for GraphDrib, which was based on Chris Decker's work as well. Chris was a genius.
Yes.
I mean, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's funny because I went, like I said at the beginning of the interview, where we went back and took a look at, the version 3 that Kevin had actually given to Brother Jeremy. And I can run it. I can see, I can resize windows and stuff like that, but it's so slow. Like it's literally for printing on graphic screens, text screens. I'd say it's several times slower, like maybe up to 5 times. Like it's night and day. It's like getting a 286 versus an 8088 type thing. And our goal with NitrOS9 for the first decade was speed. I mean, we wanted to show that 639 chip off as much as we possibly could. And we had got the tune-up thing kind of running on the side. I contributed some to that. Bill contributed some of that. It was Alan's baby who kind of amalgamated together and he did a lot more work on it. But that was something that you kind of like took up. And when you backported, it kind of forced me when I got back into NitrOS9, because originally I was just going to stick with 609 and just work from there. And then I'm going, no, but that's not really fair. And besides, we've learned more programming than 10 years since Bill and I had left, or 20 years almost, that we could do the 609 code better than we had originally done too. Right. So we've been doing that as well. And there's been noticeable speed ups all the way across. So thanks Curtis, for doing that, because it kind of kicked us in the ass to actually keep it up.
And then remember what Alan said too, it's changing the algorithms, not the actual.
Yeah, that was my first mistake. When we first did NitrOS9, I was literally like, how can I speed up that exact code? Like using 609 instructions, registers.
Right. As opposed to looking at it,
I hadn't stepped back to go, that's actually a dumb way of doing it. Why don't we do it this way instead?
Right. Yeah. So getting to the 6809 port and calling NitrOS9 for 6809, right? That was all deliberate as well, because I wanted to avoid using the word OS9, because OS9 was already marked for level 1 and level 2, and that was, an official product name.
Yeah.
So bringing NitrOS9 6309 back, porting it to 6809 made sense to me to call it NitrOS9. It was a new product with a new name, a new set of features. And I always felt that the 6809 was never going to go away. Yeah, the 6309 is great, but at the time, there was a number of them compared to the number of CoCos out there. Even today, I know there's lots of 6309s probably floating around that you could put in a CoCo. But the 6809 is the de facto default CPU in the processor in the CoCo.
Yes.
It made sense to not leave that behind and carry that into the NitrOS9 family.
Yeah. Well, I think my favorite part of you actually instigating that is that we'd added new functionality, not just optimizations. I mean, at the beginning it was just optimizations and sort of bug fixes and optimizations. But then we started adding new functionality, new system calls, extending system calls. And the fact that you backported meant that people that want to write software for NitrOS9 or OS9 don't have to pick like which CPU am I going to support, because I've got all these extra features I can use here, but I can't over here. And that actually brought all those back to the 6809. And it's the other reason, like, when I first got back into, before we even started you, but just getting back to NitrOS9 in general here 5-6 years ago, I really thought I was just going to stick with the 609 side like I had done back in the old day. But after I saw all the work you guys had done, and the fact that this made it a base level of APIs and stuff that everybody could use instead of just picking one CPU or the other, that's what changed my mind. So thank you for doing that.
That's the right thing to do.
Cool. And
because honestly, I would have been lazy and
to-
just stuck with the 609 if you hadn't done that. So.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
So since I've kind of hogged you for the whole time here, there's some people in chat have been reading out comments, but I want to see if there's any questions from people on the panel, people in the chat. If you want to fire some questions off for Boise, any questions on DriveWire, NitrOS9, cross development, working for microware if you want to, please fire some questions off here. I'm just going to check my emails because I know a few people said they might get a chance to email here too. So
I'm curious to know what you did at Microware, Boise. You were there for 8 years. I assume you worked on you said OS 868K was your primary thing?
No, I did a number of different things. So I was a software engineer. I started out working on, there was a cross-platform, incidentally, cross-hosted tool chain called Fast Track. It was a Unix-based IDE. I worked on that. I did some driver development. I did a lot of training because I was good at explaining things. I enjoyed teaching. So Micro had a training and education department. I spent a good part of my career there traveling, teaching OS9 courses and courses about our tools and about different products that we had around communications and networking for the operating system. Did some field application engineering work where I would go to a customer site and help them solve a problem with a particular system. And got to see some pretty cool, got to go to some pretty cool places as a result and see OS9 used in some very interesting applications.
Sounds very well rounded.
Yeah. I was not. Now, I also got to rub shoulders and get to know a lot of the people that worked on things like the kernel and the drivers. There were some still friends to this day with some of these people and keep in touch with them. Some of these people, I worked with Todd Earls, who was one of the CoCo Three Musketeers, Mark Hawkins, Rick Gruel, Warren Brown, just smart people that Tony Hoffman that worked in the kernel and in the 68K and the OS 9000 path. I didn't work directly with, but Peter Dibble was at Micro at the time. Saw him
there's some of the books that the CoCo posted.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course James Jones, compiler guy that was extraordinary that was there at the time. Didn't work really closely with James in terms of on the same project, but we worked in the same areas and touched a lot of work together. So yeah, just really valuable time there and good times. Enjoyed my time at Microware.
Did you work with the OS 9000 stuff as well a fair bit when you were there, or were you more the OSK? Or both?
No, I did. Well, OS 9000, it was by the time that I left, OS 9000 pretty much had taken over, and OS 968K was sort of relegated to what you might call
support.
Like, so yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I recall doing was for the 1993 Chicago CoCo Fest. I don't remember if you were there, Curtis or not, but we sold, Micro had a booth there and we sold copies of OS 9000 for the
for dirt cheap compared to the normal retail price.
Yeah, right. It was maybe not
dirt cheap as in CoCo levels prices, but compared to what OS 9000 commercially.
Yeah, I think it was $350 a package.
Yeah, and it was normally like 900 or 700 or something. I can't remember exact.
I actually came up with that idea earlier that year, and I brought it to Mike Berger, who was the VP of engineering, and said, "Look, at the time I think we were going to version 2 of OS 9000, and we had all these. I think it was 1.3 of OS 9000 x86 that were just boxes sitting at OFS, which was our order fulfillment services part of the company." I said, look, why don't we try to sell these to these CoCo guys? You know, they could maybe do something with this, get a few more adherents and discount it. So we got approval to do it. That was pretty fun.
Yeah. Well, like I said, Bill and I actually had it at work. We had Dispatch G Windows on it as well. And I don't remember which version of OS 9000. I just remember there was a whole whack load of manuals.
Mm.
And then
Yeah.
we also got the compiled Basic 09, or the equivalent of Basic 09 from what the heck was his name?
Mike Smith.
Yeah, Mike Smith.
Yes.
Yeah, Mike
And we
Smith
actually-
owned Hazelwood Computer Systems, I think.
Yeah, and then he also did the basic compiler, basically, it compiled to C, which then compiled to assembly. And he eventually made it cross-platform, so it'd work on Linux, Windows, and OSK and OS 9000.
Yeah, OmniBasic.
Yeah, OmniBasic. Yeah, I still use it actually for work now.
Yeah.
And we got to be
And
pretty
you
good
might
friends.
well.
We used to have Friday night chats every Friday. We'd just call him up in the evening. We'd shoot back and forth, and he had tales to tell, boy. But
He was in Missouri. Yeah, he was a nice guy. He passed away, but Mike and
yeah, he
I
had a
were
heart
friends.
attack, unfortunately. And right in the middle,
Yeah.
he was just starting his brand new redoing the whole thing right to straight
Yes.
assembler, bypassing
Yes.
C. We were actually helping debug some of that stuff. I still have one of his old alphas from that time period. And then we got
He
a
was
call
a
from his
gr-
brother mentioning that he'd passed away.
He was a gregarious guy. I had a good relationship with Mike Smith. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a good guy. Yeah, but we were using, I think, 1.3, 2.0, 2.1 when he did the whole GUI top end and stuff, and they added the database support 2.2. In fact, I probably still have a manual kicking around here somewhere.
Yeah.
I got it up here at the moment. I do.
Yep. OmniBasic. I remember it well. He was proud of that product as well as
Yeah,
he should
it
have
was
been.
really good. It even got some good reviews in some of the Linux journals. I did miss him. It was quite a shock because I literally had talked to him, I think, 5 days before he passed away, because he had, it was a sudden heart attack, so it was completely unexpected. But he was all hyped up. He was ready to go. I'm going to have this assembly straight to assembly. It's going to be much faster than the to C to assembler version that he had been selling up to that point. He was sent a very early alpha that he was hyped.
We have a
Unfortunately,
question from Mark Siegel.
Shoot. You want to read it out there, Mark?
Oh, sure. So Mark Siegel, of course, of Tandy and other gaming companies before that. What would you like to see happen with NitrOS9 in the future? That'd be Boise.
Or maybe all of us.
I mean, I don't. I think it's. I don't know. I mean, that's a good question.
Has it already exceeded
taken-
your expectations?
Yeah, I don't know what else you could do with it. I mean, I guess going back to what Curtis had brought up earlier, bringing in the level 2 version 3 functionality, which really hasn't been done yet, right, Curtis?
Just small pieces of it, not very much.
Right. That's probably, I think that would be the capstone for NitrOS9 is to bring that code in. And bring in resizable, and movable windows. That would be nice to have. Yeah. Beyond that, I mean, what else could you do? Run the space
one thing
shuttle
I've
with
been
it? I
thinking
don't
of
know,
personally is I would like to bring in, like you had mentioned before, you're doing stuff that's modern but could have been done back in the day. Like the physical technology existed, people just hadn't thought of doing things a certain way or certain algorithms, whatever. I think I want to see some more of that, where we can bring some more modern things, so it feels like a more modern OS, even though it's running on an old 8-bit machine.
Yeah.
Well,
One thing-
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, the one thing that I had a thought of, and I think Mark was involved with this one too, was I found a way to actually do multi-threading in NitrOS9 as well.
You're talking about within one process, within the process itself?
And like having the parent and child processes all running at the same time.
That
sharing
would
memory
be
or-
doable.
Yeah, and sharing memory through either a data module or something along that lines.
Or are you talking about multi-threading at the process level, where the process itself has multiple threads going on within the context of the process?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's room to do that in the process descriptor. That would be pretty cool. I've thought about that actually and how to implement that. It is doable.
It is doable.
It would add a bit of overhead, I think, to the operating system.
It does add a bit of overhead, but my problem was the actual data sharing between the parent and the child. Getting that. fine-tuned to be mapped into that 64K space.
Yeah, because you've got to map the parent's process, the child's,
Yeah.
at least you have to have a
The
common
data
data space
area.
for them to communicate in,
Yeah.
right? That would be where the data module is. Something that just occurred to me too that I would like to see is obviously I would like to see NitrOS9 ported to the Turbo 9. That's something that I think is doable soon. Kevin Phillipson, if you're listening, you know what you got to do to make that happen, right?
Yeah.
I would like to see it ported to some additional platforms, well, Turbo 9 and others. So I think having NitrOS9, someone was doing a custom 6809 board that wanted to do a port, I think.
Yes, there was a couple of them actually out there. I think
I would like to
Yeah,
see
I've
more
never seen
ports. So yeah, I would like to see it ported. You know, the Liberate 09, which was the 6809 board that I made for the Atari 8-bit set originally was the 6502. That was another port. That again proved further, as we had indicated, the veracity of the porting structure that we had implemented with the NitrOS9 project. So I'd say bringing NitrOS9 to other platforms through ports like the Turbo 9. And
Super Pet
Bill,
is
to
another
your
one that
point,
could be done.
Super Pet, yep.
Fujitsu's.
Yeah.
Yep,
Fujitsu's.
exactly. And bringing threading to true threading, intra-process threading, I'd say, to the
I know one
opera
that
system,
Bill and I have talked about too is that we want to try to get Alan DeCock's level 3, as he called it, the one that kind of expanded for RBF and SCA separate, because that kind of got broke. I have gone through and figured out some of what the issues are. I haven't quite got the chance to fix it yet. But
I've actually gotten a bit further on that too, Curtis, and I've been kind of keeping it quiet, but I have gotten a bit further.
That is an interesting approach where Alan basically gave each file manager its own 64K address space, right?
Only
16K.
16K.
Yeah, 16K.
Only
Swap.
16K.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And
with
kind
graph driven, the co-windows being separated out, it would just be regular quote unquote SCF, the SCF stuff. But it's basically, your drivers, descriptors, and the file manager each get their own 16K space, and it would, because you could never have a call that's doing SCF and RBF simultaneously. You're doing one or the other when you're task switching. Now, the exception to that is DriveWire. The DriveWire driver actually does both, so that's the one complicated part to figure out exactly. Do we have to split that into two? Do we have to do some sort of special communication?
Yes.
Does
go ahead.
does NitrOS9 have any hooks for like multiple processors?
Like multiple CPUs?
Yeah, if you had like multiple CPUs. Not currently.
Not that I know of. Boise, do you know if Microwave ever did that for any of the gimmicks or anything, or
any of the other versions?
Or Fujitsu?
Not for 1609.
The only ones I'm aware of, the Dragon Beta and the Fujitsu FM77, the ones that had the dual 689s, they did have a separate 69 that only did graphics. It's not really co-processing per se. It's more like its own microcontroller, I guess.
It's not like symmetric multiprocessing, but a co-processor.
Right. Yeah.
There's been a few designs floated around of putting another CPU on a card and having a shared memory space, and that'd be a logical thing to extend NitrOS9 with.
You'd have to think about where in the operating system you would add those hooks.
Right.
I'm not sure. I'd have to think more about it. It's an interesting. Again, a lot of this stuff, the utility of it just doesn't exist. It's simply the challenge of seeing it done and seeing the result of it.
Yeah.
Just like threads. I don't think there's probably a valid use case for threads that would really make an impactful difference in the applications we use on a CoCo for NitrOS9. Maybe I'm wrong, but from an academic point of view, it would be an interesting project, right?
Yeah, so even learning how it works, how to implement an 8-bit system type thing. That's the challenge.
Mark Siegel said you would need a processor with a cache. I know that way back in the 80s that there was a couple companies for the 6502, specifically the Apple, that built something called the Zip chip. And it basically was an optimized 65CO2 with an 8K cache. It had a tag cache and a RAM cache. And so it would run, the original version ran at 4 megahertz, which is 4 times the speed of the standard bus. And the later versions ran at 8. And so literally it would read through the memory at 1 megahertz, load the cache, and then run at 8 megahertz in a loop, which was a real nice speed boost.
Well, one other thing would be interesting is to have true DMA on a CoCo with some type of coprocessor. That would be another
which the 609 already has support lines to do because they were using it on the gimmicks, etc., just not on the CoCo.
Yeah,
I mean, hardware wise, I'd love to see like a 3 megahertz 6 through 9 with the Gimme X built into the new motherboard that Pedro's designing. So it's just one board and away you go. That'd be awesome too. But
there's the Turbo 9 right there. It could fit into that.
yeah, actually, good point. Good point. Exile in Paradise says NitrOS9 Vectrix game. I don't know how much memory the Vectrix has. I don't know if NitrOS9 would fit on there. I don't think it has 64K of RAM even.
Run from ROM.
I guess you could. I don't know what the ROM space on that is. Pretty sure it doesn't have an MMU.
Well,
David Ladd, I
Level 2.
wonder if it would be worth bringing the network modules ported to NitrOS9 from the OS9 systems that had actual network support. Talking about 6.809 OS9, because some of them did have. What was it? NFM was the network file manager, I think.
Yeah, that was a oh goodness. Yeah, that was not Ethernet as we know it, or not TCP/IP networking. That was its own networking protocol. NFM was basically an OS9 net that implemented its own
custom for
stack.
OS9 only, basically.
It was a custom thing, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because that's the one that Brother Jeremy had the sample boards for Micro, if I remember correctly, right? He brought them to the show one year.
Yeah,
Nobody
I've got
disassembled the
those-
ROM
I've
yet, so
got
we didn't
those
know how it
now.
worked.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
How,
Yep, I
how
have
did the
those
hardware
boards.
work? Was it like a broadband or baseband or ArcNet?
It was twin lead coax that would hook up to this thing. I have to.
Okay.
I need to take pictures of the board. There was some kind of
cool.
chip on. I looked it up one time. My memory fails me on what exactly was what it was in there, but there was some type of a networking chip. It was a twin lead coax that you would hook up to it to another, I guess, CoCo, and do some type of networking. Maybe Mark Siegel remembers some of this.
Yeah, that's one where I think it would be interesting to figure out how that one worked, but I think there's more modern network card solutions and even other different protocols like BW and stuff that probably would be more appropriate nowadays.
Oh, no
rather than
doubt.
coming
No
with something
doubt.
totally custom again.
And less hardware you have to make from scratch.
Yeah, because the one thing we're still dealing with, especially if we want to stay with the real CoCos as opposed to running emulators and stuff, is that, some hardware is still scarce. So you don't want to cut your nose off to spite your face there. Mark Siegel says ArcNet.
Excellent.
ArcNet.
I've used ArcNet before.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, because I remember Mark Marlette was actually trying to figure out exactly how that worked at one point, because I think he had him in his possession for a bit too. Excellent. Actually, this is a question I should have asked you, because I've actually thought about this, asking you this as well, just not during this particular interview. But what's next for CoCo Collector? Because you could kind of taken a bit of a break from it.
I've got to get the CoCo Deluxe documented. That's my next thing.
Cool.
In fact, I was talking to Tim Lindner about him setting up a MAME emulator or an emulation profile in MAME for that machine. It's not hard to do. It's basically a CoCo one with a lowercase
sound chip,
VDG
serial
and
port.
and
Basically, it's
sound
like a
port, simple,
Dragon with the sound chip, like the Dragon Alpha was supposed to have.
pretty much. Yeah. I
Is yours
out
fully
the,
functional? Or you've got the custom ROMs with the RAM drives and all that stuff on it?
No, I never got the custom ROMs with the RAM drive on it. I don't know if that even exists. I know it was worked on, but I don't have that. I was able to make a DriveWire ROM, motherboard ROM for it, and boot DriveWire OS9 level 1 on it.
Oh, okay.
I did that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm looking forward to that. The CoCo 4 case one is a really interesting one. Of course, we've had the differing opinions between Mark and other people too. So
there's many opinions on that one.
A lot of people think it's ugly. Yeah.
Yeah.
They think it's ugly, but they sure like to have it, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Just the fact they were going to 3.5-inch drives, I think, would be awesome. That's one thing I wish had happened, because OS9 supported 720K disks natively. It would have been perfect. King's Quest 3, not 5 floppies that are double-sided, just one 720K and you're done. Would have been great. That's how I ran it back in the day.
Yep, that's how we did. Most of our stuff was on 3 now.
You mean 1.6 megabyte?
Of course. Yeah. John Laurie asked, so why did the CoCo Deluxe never happen? If you want to find that out, John, watch our interview with Mark Siegel from, I can't remember how long ago.
Mark's got the skinny on that.
Yeah, there's a complete explanation here. We're not going to get into that in this particular interview.
I do believe there's actually a CoCo Deluxe port in NitrOS9, right? There's a Deluxe CoCo port.
There is comments in there in the source code that I've seen.
And you do have some Deluxe source code
here and there.
You do have some Deluxe source code, like you've got the there was a a GFX2 module or a sound module for Base CO9 that's specifically called the AY chip that was on the Deluxe.
Yeah,
to do
if
the
you
sound
go
and stuff.
if you go under the NitrOS9 / level 1 folder, there's a folder called Deluxe. So there's a port folder for that machine. I remember doing it.
Yeah, I remember seeing
Yeah,
some of
no,
the
like I
notes
said,
there.
I remember seeing comments about that too in the source.
I see
code.
there's also a port for the Corsham, which was a 6809
Yes, the
board
Corsham,
that, yeah. I forgot about that. The Dragon Alpha, which was I think an unreleased version of the Dragon. MC09, which I think was a custom board.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was Neil
Let's
Crooks.
see
Yeah.
Yep.
Mark Siegel in the chat saying the Deluxe was complete and ready to produce. He also said Deluxe OS9 was complete as well. So I mean everything was ready to go. Kind of wish that had
I know
happened.
this is I know this is getting off here a bit of topic, but just real quick interject. I think that the level 1 version 2 upgrade, level 1 version 2 upgrade, there were hints of the Deluxe CoCo in the modules that were in that upgrade. There were some hints about it.
Yeah. Well, I know the lowercase VDG was actually kind of hidden in there, if I remember correctly, which is something the Deluxe was going to have as well.
Yeah.
Before the T1 eventually got released with the CoCo 2 instead.
Yeah.
Mark just posted it's episode 236. We interviewed Mark Siegel. That was a long one. That was a good interview. That was fun. Any other questions from the panel? David Ladd, I'm surprised you're not asking anything because we're going to invite you for the third part here because you were helping with some of the testing and level 1 stuff I even helped with when I first got back into it.
Nah, I annoyed Boise too much when he first allowed me into the stuff. So I try not to annoy him too much.
No, I think David, you actually did some good contributions too as well. Let me see if your name. You was just D Ladd, right? At the time, yeah.
I believe on SourceForge, I believe I'm Drencore, but yeah, it's
that's what it is. Yeah,
Drencore.
Yeah, you've got some stuff. I'm looking in the Git log, and you've got some contributions. The earliest one looks like it is. I see 2013. Don't know how far back it goes, but it looks like you have some contributions. So, yep, 2013 is the earliest one. 2012, December 2012. Changed rules.make to remove -L option in the A flags. Woohoo.
Well, that's one other thing too. Like I actually, one other question I wanted to ask, and I kind of forgot to ask earlier. You were doing most of the actual development. You had a few other contributors like Robert Galt and a few others during that decade. Who did you have for testers? Were you just doing testing yourself, or did you have a suite of testers, or how did the testing work?
I did it myself. Again, really the early testing amounted to assembling, comparing of the binary to the original, verification, fixing, go to the next. That was it. Once that was done, I mean, once every module was confirmed to assemble back to the original binary, byte for byte, size for size, and everything,
CRC.
the work was done. Yeah, CRC. Yeah, the work was done. That was the whole goal. Then
did you have a suite of beta testers for your cross assembly tools and stuff like Mamu and Drawbar?
Yeah, I think Tim Linder helped with Toolshed at the time and Mamu. We didn't have anything like automated testing or unit tests. We didn't really get that deep into that aspect of it. But Tim helped quite a bit with that, as I recall. And just make a note, Mamu is obviously deprecated. Everything is moved over to William Hassel's tools now. Yeah, which is much, much better. So it was a big improvement there.
But I did want to give a shout out to the testers because I know we had multiple testers during the commercial part of NitrOS9. We probably had about 5 to 10 different people. Colin Mackay is one just off the top of my head.
There were people that didn't contribute to the repository that I can't recall offhand that I know didn't contribute to the project, but pulled down the source code, built it, tested it that way. But there was no formal testing group.
Okay. We had a kind of informal testing group. And I know that like in the returning for the EOU part, I mean, David Ladd's been one of my testers and there's numerous other people involved too. And they have found some bugs. I mean, James Jones found a bug in Base CO9 that I screwed up when I optimized a 639 chunk. And he's actually
yes.
testing the current tests or updates to basically that'll be part of the next version of EOUs. So I want to give a shout out to the testers, because they don't always get the limelight. They're not showing up in the GitHub logs and all that kind of stuff, but they're critical to make sure that, because basically we get to the point where you can't see the forest for the trees. You're just seeing what you're expecting to come out, and you're not noticing the little subtleties that aren't right type thing. So I want to give them a shout out.
I thought David
Shout
Ladd
out
was
to
the breaker.
testers.
Well, that's part of beta testing. If you can break it,
That is
obviously you
part
need
of
to fix
testing.
something.
Unless, of course,
right.
you're getting those nice screensavers Curtis would always give me.
Yeah, anytime I did a graphic driver, I'd send it, especially the CoCo VJ, because I didn't have one at the time. So I'd do some little optimization thing, send it off to David, and he said, "It crashed. Here's a picture of it, and it's got a bunch of random, gibberish and graphic mode that wasn't supposed to be enabled or whatever else." So. Some more comments. It has so much of the kind of feel of Unix and early BSD from the 80s. It's different and new feeling in some places, and yet pure old school in so many ways too. I agree. I think from research that Jeff and a few others have done, and you probably know this better than most, Boise, is that OS9 itself was based on one of the earlier versions of Unix, though they customized it for the 8-bit environment.
Yeah. Wasn't it BSD that you guys microwave based it off of, or no?
I really can't comment on that. The only relation to Unix that I've always associated OS9 with was a comment in the manual that, and I can't recall exactly, I think Ken Kaplan was the one that had come up with it, but something to the effect that OS9 was similar to Unix, but there was some witty saying about how much smaller, or I don't remember. But I think one could say that OS9 was inspired by Unix, not necessarily branched from Unix or anything like that. But
no, I'm not saying a branch, but
right. But I would say it was inspired, and then probably loosely, because there's nothing. What makes OS9 unique from Unix or any other operating system is its modularity and the way that it constructs itself in terms of the way that you construct it, rather with modules.
Yeah.
Only at the superficial user state layer, with the commands, the idea of a shell, the idea of processes, the idea of having multiple processes running, that is kind of where it feels a lot like Unix. But it really is its own category of operating system in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Mark C in the chat is saying version 7. Ken Kaplan, I'm assuming he's meaning, told me that they had the source code for version 7.
System 7, yeah, very, very likely. Yeah. I'm sure that, I know Ken was going to Drake University at the time, probably had access to that through the university, I'm assuming, and no doubt looked at the source code, studied it. But I have to believe that, as opposed to looking at, well, not just looking at the source code, but mostly looking at the design of Unix is what inspired them to do OS9. The actual way that everything architecturally tied together in Unix was their inspiration for it, is my guess.
Yeah, and of course they were trying to optimize it as much as possible for a smaller memory footprint, and that's where shareable modules.
Correct.
Which is a huge way to save memory. You could have the same program loaded once, and you could run it in like 6 different instances. I remember when Kevin Darling used to comment on the Amiga OS, which was preemptive multitasking, like we were. But they, at that time, they'd have to load it each time. If you wanted 3 shells, you had to load shell program itself 3 times, plus their own data areas. And on OS9, you did load it once, and you get 3 separate data areas. So you were cutting the memory footprint down drastically.
Yeah, when you think about it, it was pretty ingenious, right? Separating your data and your program memory, and then reusing your program memory for multiple processes. The only thing you had to duplicate was the process descriptor, right? Yep. Which is what would make one process unique from the other, which was a very small piece of memory. I think 512 bytes.
512 bytes in level 2, and less than that. I think
64 on level 1. It's nothing.
Yeah. Well, in a lot of ways, it was way ahead of time. In fact, Exile in Paradise is mentioning there, he said the IO man divide was far ahead of its time. Later, Sun would call that VFS.
Yep. And that's actually a part of NitrOS9 that I think remains somewhat unexploited, is the file manager level. Not everybody, but drivers are easy to write, relatively speaking. File managers is really what separates the men from the boys, right? It's not oftentimes you need to write a file manager anyway, but writing one is really every layer that you go up in the IO hierarchy in OS9 gives you more and more power, right?
Yeah.
So you start at the driver level, you can do so much within the purview of RBF or SCF or whatever driver you have. You go up to the file manager level, and then, you can really do a lot more and create your own world and your own data structures for what you want to do under the purview of IO man.
Yeah. Well, I remember how impressed I was when I first got into going through RBF in particular, because at that time, I mean, the fact it was multitasking, allowing multiple processes to hit files at the same time, and yet they had individual record chunk locking and full file locking and all this stuff built into an 8-bit OS from 1980 when they did the first version, 1983 for the CoCo. Even level 1 had that, where you could open a file, let's say 100K, and like, I want to lock in this 512 byte chunk here because I'm modifying this part of the database. Yet somebody else is looking at the database and they would just get an IO lock error saying this part's being used, go do something else for a while. And you could literally like have all this stuff and it's all built into the OS already at that point. I don't know anything else besides Unix, et cetera, that would have had that kind of functionality. DOS for sure as hell didn't, and Windows didn't at the beginning either. It would just lock the whole file.
And that was in the RBF version of the CoCo. I mean, that was probably an underappreciated and underutilized feature that no one using the CoCo would probably even think about, but that code was there.
Yeah, RBF was a masterpiece. I mean, me just trying to go through and disassembly. I think Bill and Alan did more disassembly on that than I did, but even the chunks that I did, it was like, wow, this is genius, for the time period.
I did a chunk of it, or remember that, but I didn't do the entire thing because there was still a few things I couldn't figure out what was going on.
Yeah, it's a complex bit of code, but it has to be to handle multi-users, multitasking, hitting the same files at the same time, and not screwing up the file system or corrupting files. Like it.
Right.
That was a lot of
one writer,
on it.
Multiple readers. Right.
Yeah.
Well, multiple writers too.
And not in the same area though, right? Within different.
No,
areas.
you get the IO record
sector.
locking if you did that.
Right. When you record locking for that one.
But you could if you had an index at the start of a file, and then you had chunks of data, you could lock like just the index until you updated that. And you could lock, you could open a separate path to the same file and lock different chunks so that you could actually leave parts of the file open for other people to use. It was genius level stuff. That was really impressive for me. And I wouldn't even have thought of that, talking about trying to write a file manager, like that would have just blew my mind.
That is why trying to modify RBF is such a tedious task. That's why also commenting it would be critical, right? To really understand it, because you could easily break something.
That did happen.
Yeah.
In the commercial days, we had one of our contributors. I won't mention his name because I didn't want to slam him on purpose. And he had good intentions, but he was adding a feature for keeping track whether a file had been backed up. If you're doing full backups of a system, and he took the last segment and put in some flags there instead, but he forgot to change the code that said you have 47 segments now maximum, not 48. Alan DeCock actually is the one who hit it because he was running it on a large file, and it went, the file got extended. It went to the 48th segment, and then RBF went and changed it on them when he closed the file to basically mark it as being not archived. And now all of a sudden this file is corrupt because it lost the last segment entirely. So, and he was mad.
Comment.
I mean, you can still see comments in the code.
The comment, there's a legendary comment in rbf.asm that I kept in there specifically.
Yeah.
That I know exactly what you're talking about. I know who it is too. So funny stuff.
Yeah. Good intention, but that's where the planning that Micro put into getting that whole thing set up the way it was. You have to plan that carefully for a file manager because there's so many things that can go wrong, and you're at such a high level with so many things going on.
There be dragons there.
Yeah. But I remember, Bill, when we were doing RBF in the commercial days, there was a change. One of us did. It might have been me.
It was mine. It was my change that I did in RBF, and it just blew up. I can't remember.
But it was subtle. It was subtle though, because the first time we noticed it was trying to run the LHA archiver, and all of a sudden it was getting corrupted weirdness and stuff like that. And then you finally tracked it down. It was a change that we had done to speed something up.
Again, you're touching the most critical aspect of a person's system, the file system. If you do anything to mess that up, you're going to be hung, tarred and feathered.
Undrawn and quartered,
Yeah,
exactly.
Oh no, like as soon as we figured that bug out, it got ripped out. Nope. Let's go back to the original.
That's where quality testing really matters, obviously.
And that's why, like nowadays, I try to get out to beta testers like David and some others here, James Jones. I'll try to do stuff that's within a person's specialty, because some people, if they're not interested in file systems, they're interested in games, I'll give them the latest game change to test or whatever type thing, or maybe a G shell update. But try to get some people that have some expertise in there, know how to hammer, know what to kind of look for, because they're familiar with that part of the system already.
Right.
Okay, I don't think I have any more questions myself. Last chance for the panel, and the chat will be a few seconds behind, so we'll give them a little bit of time in case they have any additional questions to ask as well. But I just wanted to preemptively thank Boise for coming on and relaying this part of the history of NitrOS9, because honestly, Bill and I were out of the community enough. We're still on the periphery, kind of looking at things, but we didn't know everything Boise was doing. I had no idea about Mamu until years later. I didn't know about a lot of the stuff.
The only time I figured out what Boise did was when I read the book from him and Bill. That's when I really realized.
those I'd say 2002, when the internet was around, but we didn't have the collaboration tools that we have now with GitHub and SourceForge. So a lot of that work was just 4 or 5 people working by themselves. I think the CoCo list might have been a way of communicating at the time. In fact, one of the things I intended to do for this interview but didn't was go back and try to find some of those earlier CoCo list messages, because I do remember giving status updates about the project there and people commenting about it. But this was pre-Facebook, right?
Yeah,
that's before, way before Facebook.
Social media didn't exist as it is today. So disseminating progress, on the project was just not really a priority. And so that history does tend to get a little muted, but I'm very happy to come on and talk about it and kind of give some color to it. And again, remembering that the fact that this sort of, I would call in the middle of the NitrOS9 history. And of course, you've got the later to talk about for the last 10 years or so.
Yeah. I'll probably hit you up for a list of some of the contributors, because you probably were, especially at the beginning of the third decade, you probably were a bit more involved and kind of knew what people were specializing in what. So maybe I'll get some suggestions, because that could potentially be a huge panel if I tried to include everybody that's been involved with it since. It would be like an 8-hour show just to get everybody logged in.
Well, that's just getting some of the initials figured out and the actual names. That's what I found in the source code.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting idea, Bill, is going through the source code and saying, because everybody by standard put the
3-letter initial.
Yeah. So BGP would be me. There was PWZ for Paul W. Zabalia.
Yeah.
I don't remember if Gene Heskett, what he
Gene
used.
Heskett was G.
Well, it was
ATD was Alan DeCock. I remember that.
Yeah.
LCB was me.
Yeah. Tim Linder, I don't remember what he used. So yeah, it'd be interesting to go through and find out what those, get sort of a unique sort of the union of all those different 3-letter combinations and see who contributed. You kind of infer from that.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark Oberhoser, for posting a plug for Boise's book, which is still on sale on Amazon.
Go buy it. It's still available, I think.
And I think I've asked you this before, but just I think you said you don't have any interest right now in doing like an update, what's happened the last 10 years type thing.
No.
Understandable, because that was a lot of work for you to do the first time, and that was years of research.
Yeah. I think there's plenty of other sources online to document that now that are probably much more better than a stale book.
Yeah.
So
Mark Siegel makes a good point too. It's 30 years of NitrOS9 and over 40 years for OS9, because OS9
40 years of
came
OS9,
out in 1980, so 42 years.
Yeah.
And they did RT68 even before that. So
yeah, I think the copyright year for OS9 level 1, when you boot it up for the CoCo, is 1980 by Motorola and Microware, as I recall.
Yeah,
so,
same as Basic 9 is 1980 for both.
Yeah. In fact, I think one of the interesting things you could do is go to earlier magazines like maybe Byte and see what the earliest Microware ad was and see where OS9 sort of started.
Yeah, Alan Huffman and I have been kind of researching that, because he's been doing some blog posts and some of that too. And I've been going to what was it, 6-8 Microjournal was another one that used to advertise the original stuff.
Yes.
Microware.
Microware advertised heavily in there. I believe. So yeah, that would be an interesting.
Yeah, because they even had their RT68
Interesting.
product before, basically on it, and even before the 6809 came out.
Exile just posted that the RT68 ad.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody had mentioned about the anniversary of OS9 itself. I've been trying, like, I know Alan actually is in direct contact with Ken Kaplan quite a bit. And we're trying to arrange to see if we can get Ken and maybe one or two of the other original microware guys on for an interview too. So if I do manage to arrange that, Boise, would you want to be on the panel for that as well? To ask questions?
I could. I can give you names. There's Ken Kaplan, Robert Doggett, Robert and I were in touch some years back, but I haven't talked to him in a number of years. And then Larry Crane.
Yeah, and that's the original Control A hidden message on SCF, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. They would certainly be an interesting group of people to interview. I think just them three alone would be plenty. You'd have a lot of really, really early history of microware there if you could do that.
Yeah. Did you ever had a chance to talk to them much, or were you kind of on your own little part of microware most of the time?
Well, when I worked at microware, I wouldn't see him often, but run into Ken in the hall, and we'd occasionally have a chat, talk about things. Larry, I worked with Larry, I was more in the same building as Larry was. Larry was still in engineering at microware at the time, although he was very high up at that point. But I'd see Larry a lot more, and Larry and I had interesting discussions about his work on RBF. Larry, I think, was the one that did all that record locking stuff in RBF.
My hat's off to him.
Then,
if you see him again before I get a chance to, definitely pass it on, because that's some gorgeous code in there.
Kim Kempf was a good friend of mine. He had worked on the C compiler early on for microware, so he was another one who is probably not as well known name wise as Larry or Robert or Ken, but did a lot of interesting work there too. So Kim is still around. I think I'm friends with him on Facebook, so he might be somebody you could get for an interview at some point.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm still trying to line that up. And because you work there, you probably would know some questions to ask that I wouldn't even think of, type thing. So if you're available at the time, assuming we can get it to happen, I'd love to have you on as a guest panelist for that one. And I'm still trying to get a hold of Kevin Darling and some of them. I'd love to get them in for a group interview talking about just a variety of stuff. I mean, the Inside NitrOS9 Level 2 book, which was critical for Bill and me doing NitrOS9. The version 3 upgrade, of course. And just all the stuff they were working on, like the network card they were working on, that they stuff for the deluxe, and also the driver work for disto and all kinds of things. Love to get that. One thing we're trying to do with our interview series is trying to get down some of this history before the people are no longer here to talk about it. And that kind of germinated in my head back when Kent passed away, because he told me a lot of good stories and stuff, and I don't remember them all. That sucks. I never wrote them down, didn't record it, because it was just casual conversations at a CoCo Fest type thing. So now I'm trying to. That's why we had Mark on for I think it was a 4-hour interview or something like that, because you don't want to lose this stuff. And because the CoCo was always an underdog computer, we don't have like 15 books on the single founder type thing, like some of the more common systems like the Commodores and the Ataris did. So I think both of our podcasts actually are trying to capture some of the history of various interviews. So big thanks to both of us, I guess, for that. Okay, I don't see any other questions from there. Any questions, last chance from the panel? Otherwise, I think we can wrap this interview up, and we'll merge it with either this upcoming episode on Saturday when it gets released afterwards, or we'll merge it with the following one, depending on how long the live from Brazil retro computer show goes.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It was good to see everyone.
Yeah,
thanks for joining.
Seeing you, Boise.
Yeah, thanks for coming
Take
on.
care. You bet. See y'all soon.